Despite Matthew Schaefer having not taken the ice since the last edition of our rankings, he starts at number one. Brock, I'll start with you. Could you just break down his season so far and what keeps him in first despite the incredible season of a guy like Michael Misa hot on his heels?
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of different things that come into play here. Number one, just his on ice performance this year. He has been the best player pretty much anytime he's hit the ice, whether it's been with the Erie, whether it's been at the Malinka, whether it's been at the World Juniors before his injury. He's just a guy that continues to step up and perform at a high level. I think you also have to factor in that he's one of the youngest players eligible for the draft this year too. So there's a lot of runway for physical development. He's not done maturing yet, and that's kind of a scary concept because he's going to continue to get better. I'm not worried about the injury at all. It was a freak injury. It's not something like an ACL or an Achilles or anything like that. That's going to be, something that has a serious risk attached to it. So for us, Schaefer's upside as a true number one defender, somebody like a Drew Doughty, like a Cale Makar, that kind of impactful player, that's a number one overall pick in our opinion, because those are hard to find.
Yeah, even though we don't have a ton of games of Schaefer this year, I think he's shown enough in the games that he has played to get a very good and comfortable understanding of who he is, what his upside is. And I mean, honestly, we might even like him more, as Brock was alluding to, if he had been playing more, right? Like he's still got so much more development that's going to come in his game. And the fact that he's already had so much success, with the situation, playing on a bad Erie team last year, going through some off ice, tragedy, um, going through this injury process now that it's incredible that he's been able to do so much in such a little amount of time. And maybe, there's a little bit of risk to that because the book you have on the player isn't as big as it is as others. But I mean, that can be a blessing or a curse, right? I mean, there might not even be any kind of debate that's maybe starting to creep up now in some circles about Mista possibly competing for number one. There might not be any discussion at all if Schaefer had played all season because he was just improving so quickly and taking such big strides in his development and his on ice play that it's very easy to see where he could go in the future, where he would be now if he was healthy. There's just so much upside, and I think that's too hard to ignore, even though that he just hasn't played a lot.
I'd like to ask you a bit just about his development arc. So, as far as I can remember back going into his OHL draft year, I think Ryan Rubrick, for instance, was talked about ahead of him, and he had an excellent year. He had an excellent year with the Halton Hurricanes and worked his way up to being selected first overall. And Erie, obviously joining a great list of first overall picks with that organization. But, coming into the year, he was a first overall candidate. I would say, people mostly had Hagens first overall, but now at this point, it's like we're talking about near unanimous. So could you guys just help me break down sort of how the dominoes fell to Matthew Schaefer being the prospect he is today, and what were the boxes that you kind of had to check off along the way as he developed to go, yeah, I'm ready to say he's the best player available in this draft class.
Yeah, I think coming into the year, we had seen some really standout international performances from Matthew, and it was just about finding that consistency at the OHL level. He had a good OHL rookie season, but I wouldn't say it was fantastic. And I think we just kind of wanted to temper our expectations for him and make sure that we were concrete in our assessment of his upside as a true number one and not just a solid maybe first pairing guy or third defender. We wanted to make sure that this was a player that had that number one upside. And I think his play in Erie this year, on top of the way he started the year at the Lincoln Gretzky, really showed that he deserved to push far up the draft ranking board. So when we say far, we're not talking about like a huge rise. Obviously, we're talking about from like that 4 or 5 spot to number one in a year where, yeah, I think Hagens was the number one coming into the year based on his performance with the NDDP and the U18 program. But like I said earlier, that true number one defender is just so hard to find. And when a player makes a push to show that he can be that for your organization, that's a cornerstone. That's something that you completely build around and can change the face of your franchise. And I think that's sort of what Schaefer can do. And I think he's also the kind of guy that is positional need proof. By that, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you've already got an amazing stud young blue liner in the system or a couple amazing stud young blue liners in the system. You're taking Schaefer anyway because he's that good. You don't pass up on that opportunity. And you mentioned earlier about like sort of his arc. I remember watching him at the OMHAs in his OHL draft year and just thinking like, man, this is a very impressive defender. This is an unreal skater. And I remember being excited to sort of see how his game developed because I'd heard such great things, and then the eye test really matched that. So he's a guy that I think has been sort of lying in the weeds, waiting to sort of blossom into the player that he is, and he's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you can tell a player has a tantalizing set of tools, but they're not necessarily putting it together yet. And so that leaves you wondering a little bit. Like with Schaefer, I mean, his skating ability was always obvious, but it wasn't being generated into a lot of offensive production last year. So that was one of the questions I had about him coming in. At the Holinka tournament, he was a tremendous generator of offense for Canada, and then that carried over into his OHL season. That was the only kind of question I had about him because I saw the hockey stance, I saw his ability to defend the rush. He was always very positionally sound, very smart defenseman. But when I saw him kind of unlock that ability to see the offensive side of the game more and know when to jump in, how to find seams, how to just leave more of an impact, that was all the evidence that I needed. That was the last thing I was looking for out of him. And when I saw that, I'm like, okay, this is a defenseman that can be a high impact player in all three zones now, in all situations. And that was really the last piece of the puzzle.
Michael Misa of the Saginaw Spirit moves up to second overall in this edition of our rankings, surpassing James Hagens. Obviously, Misa has had a historic season. 62 goals is the most. 62 goals is the most by a draft eligible player in the OHL this century, tying Patrick Kane, passing some incredible names. I think it's fair to say after kind of maybe a somewhat disappointing second season, this was certainly an absolutely an exceptional year for an exceptional stylist talent. Brock, what have you made overall of the season now that it's coming to its conclusion, now that we're in the playoffs? And what influence you guys putting him over Hagens?
I think he's just a little bit more of a dynamic player, and that's no offense to James Hagens, but I think when you look at the complete package here of Michael Misa, I think he's a more talented goal scorer. I think he's a slightly more dynamic skater. He's a bigger player. I think it's very impressive that he's been able to play center full time this year with Saginaw after playing the wing mostly in his OHL career prior to that. And I think he's proven that he can stick down the middle and be a center at the NHL level. I think that he's just a really impressive offensive player that I also think has the potential to be more than just that. I think that with his size and his tenacious approach, I think he's going to be somebody that can play on the penalty kill and develop into, a pretty decent two-way player. And I think that sort of gives him the edge over Hagens at this current moment, who I think, while maybe a little bit more polished right now in some ways in his off puck play, and maybe a little more consistent in that regard. I think maybe more consistent in his decision making with the puck too, but you also have to look at the age gap there and the things that Hagens has already experienced as a late birthday, and playing at with the program for 2 years and now playing in college. And I think there's a lot of things that have to be factored in here. And I think Misa has just proven that, as you said, he's an exceptional player, and I think that there's a chance that he is a more dynamic NHL player.
For me, the thing that's won me over the most with Misa is how much he's advanced different parts of his game this year, which I wasn't fully expecting him to do. I mean, his ability to finish is a lot better than it was last year. I think his skating was notched up another level. I think his off puck play has improved by a lot. And that's what you really want to see out of prospects moving forward, right? Because when you're transitioning from the junior level to, let's say, the AHL to the NHL, you have to adapt. You're being forced to face new challenges. You have to be continually evolving your game, and it's a good sign when you can see a player that could do it at a high end level. I mean, did anyone expect Michael Misa to become as good of a goal scorer as he is right now? I don't think so. And it's not just he went from like an okay goal scorer to a good goal scorer. He became a great goal scorer. And I think that caught a lot of people by surprise. And we just look at the overall package. I think he's a lot more well-rounded than James Hagens is. I still like James Hagens a lot. He's a very talented prospect, but I also haven't seen the same sort of adaptation that I was hoping to see out of him at the NCAA level. He still seems very much like the same player he was last year, and some of the things that were working for him last year are still working for him. But I think he just hasn't quite adjusted to the NCAA level as much as I was hoping for or expecting him to. His game is a little bit to the outside. I don't find that his pace is as good as it was at other levels. So there's still a lot there to like, and that's not to say that he's not able to make those adjustments at some point in the future. But when you're looking at, where the players are today and where they're going, I think Misa has just shown more this season. It makes me think he's going to have a higher NHL ceiling than Hagens will.
Yeah, what really convinced me with Misa is the details of his game. Maybe this is stuff that you guys have been noticing longer than me, but just stuff like he makes a drop pass. He's lifting the defender's stick to make room for his winger's shot. Or the other night off the face-off, it was a set play where he lifted the other center stick, put it through his legs, and then his winger came on. Like he's at the point now, and he was never at this level last year, in my opinion, for more than maybe a game at a time when he just had all this skill and the rush after rush after rush where you just can't touch him. He's like that every game now. And, I've watched him in London a couple times. Saginaw's beat London, London's beat Saginaw. And even when London's beaten Saginaw handily, he still looks like, he should have picked up 3, 4 points. So he's kind of at that level where, you have to start to treat him, with the names he's in the midst of. If you want to look at points per game, since I've been alive, 1999, McDavid's above him, Kane's above him, Sam Gagner, Marco Rossi, Jason Spezza, and that's it. 2.06 points per game. Incredible stuff. So I'd just like maybe if you guys could help me kind of break down the rankings a little bit in terms of rough tiers. So Misa is passing Hagens. Hagens now coming in at third with Martone still at fourth. Would you draw the line there, or would you consider guys like Jackson Smith, Caleb Denoyer, Victor Eklund, etc., or would you still consider a rough first overall race? I mean, you called it a two-horse race before we started talking.
Yeah, I would
I mean,
say
Derek,
that.
yeah, you go first.
Yeah, I would say right now there's two names. I would say in the race for third with Hagens and then Porter Martone. And I think which player gets picked first between those two would really depend on what teams are looking for. I mean, both players are very interesting, very talented, but are very, very different. And I think that teams would value them differently, depending on what they're looking for in their prospect pool. But yeah, I think you touched on something that's interesting right now. Is I think there are other names that are slowly starting to creep in. I mean, Anton Frondel has had a very, very strong second half of his season. He's showing himself to be now the player that we were expecting him to be all season. Looks like he's recovered from some of the injury issues he was going through. He's back to more of a normal self. He's shaken off a lot of the rust. So that's been very, very interesting. I would say that he's probably the one that's going to be pushing into that sort of area. Maybe you could see a player like Jackson Smith kind of sneak into there if there is a team that loses out on Schaefer but really, really needs a defenseman. I mean, you look at the way that Beckett Seneca jumped up draft boards last year as a guy that didn't have necessarily the best season, but just had a really interesting package of physical tools. And you could sort of see the way that his game was capable of taking that big leap forward this season, which it has. There's some of that with Smith as well, where he's a fantastic skater, exceptional athlete. He knows how to play physical. He's really taken big strides on the offensive side of his game. All the pieces aren't perfectly fitting together yet, but they're getting more and more cohesive as time goes on. And if he, ends up at the U18s, his Tri-City team is down now as well. And if he has a great tournament at the U18s, I could see him being a guy who rises up draft boards pretty late.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I kind of see it as like for me, it's a little bit different than Derek's opinion. I would have it as Schaefer, then I would have it as Misa, and then I would actually have a group of players that I think are kind of in that third overall candidacy. Obviously Hagens, obviously Martone, but for me, Frondell is right there. Caleb Denoyer is right there. Smith, McQueen are right there. That's a big group for me. I think it just depends on how the season finishes out for some of these guys. I want to see how they perform in their respective playoffs. Frondell has been pretty good so far in his Swedish League playoffs. Whether we see him at the U18s, I think is just dependent on how that goes. There's a lot to still play out here. But I'm also a little bit higher on Frondell than some of the other members of our team who I think are a little bit more cautious in regards to his recent swing of positive play. I think I came into the year really high on Frondell, and I kind of thought that the beginning of the year was just a recovery from injury and a bit more of a aberration as opposed to a blip on the radar, if you will. And I think what we're seeing right now is a real Anton Frondell that we would have seen all year if not for those injuries at the beginning of the season. So maybe I'm just a little bit more optimistic about his upside than some other members of our team, but I still have a little bit of time to convince them.
just one more comment on, the draft quality and the tiers. Um, the last draft or one of the more recent drafts where there wasn't kind of a locked in first overall pick. 2017, Nico Hischier went first overall. Nolan Patrick was kind of the first overall candidate that Hischier kind of passed him. And obviously it's not the same situation because everybody has Schaefer at first overall now, but people thought 2017 was kind of a weaker year and Cale Makar came out of it. Do you see any parallels whatsoever? I have seen quite a few people not afraid to drop the Makar comparison with Schaefer.
Yeah, I think that all things considered, this is a solid draft because there's a lot of good talent at the top end of it. And that's ultimately what a draft is going to be graded on, right? Is the top end talent that comes out of it. Looking back on it, not every draft is going to be a 2003 where the, 100 NHLers, that's just a number I'm throwing out there, but it certainly feels like that many solid NHL players came out of that draft, right? Not only do they have high end talent, but they had depth for days. Very rarely do you speak of that, right? It's the top end talent that gets talked about when you're grading a draft class, and this draft class has a ton of that. The top 20, the top 15, there's some really good players that are going to be difference makers for an NHL franchise. It's more so just the depth of this draft isn't amazing, at least right now, based on what we're seeing. And that's sort of why maybe it gets talked about in a weaker light. In regards to Schaefer, yeah, I really do believe that he can be a franchise cornerstone, a true number one. And if we didn't believe that, I don't think we would have that clear definition of him at one. I think he would be sort of grouped in with other members of this draft class that we've already spoken about. I think, if we didn't feel that Schaefer was a true potential number one, we wouldn't have him as a concrete first overall pick.
And to echo on what Brock was just saying, I think we have seen a bit of a solidification in that really top tier or top few tiers, I would say till about 10, 11, 12. I think the draft has turned out to be pretty strong overall. I wouldn't say it was like that all season. There were a few players that kind of came in late. We'll probably talk about here that I think have really solidified their position near there. But I also think that what Brock said about maybe not the overall depth is also true. I think once you get to around pick 13, 14, it really starts to get a little hazy. Maybe around 20, early 20s, there's a bit of a drop off again, and then another 15 to 20 players that could be first rounders, but it's a little bit uncertain. So I think there's a good top of the draft, but maybe not the same amount of depth that made like the 2003 draft such a memorable one. So I would say it's a good draft overall. I think it's shaking out that way, especially at the top, but maybe not quite as deep as some other ones.
You can take a look at our full rankings. Our top 32 is available for free. Our top 100 is available our top 100 is available for oh my goodness. Our top 100 is available for our premium subscribers over at mckeenshockey.com. Obviously, tons more analysis, film room, articles, and reporting. I'm going to take a look at some risers and fallers in our list. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to start at the top of the list and go to the bottom rather than just hopping all over and talking about who's the actual biggest riser in terms of spots. That makes sense. So I just wanted to start with McQueen. Obviously, he's dealt with a lot of injury troubles. I haven't gotten a look at him since he's returned from injury, but he is back in the lineup with the Brandon Wheat Kings in the WHL playoffs. We've called him a faller. Are you considering the injury into that as kind of having a permanent effect on his career, or is it just a case of other players, rising above him more so?
Well, there's so many different variables at play with McQueen, which makes it so tricky. I don't think that I view him all that differently than I did earlier on this season. It's more so been other players have stepped up. At the start of the year, just speaking out of the Western region, I would have had McQueen pretty comfortably ahead of Jackson Smith. Uh, but the questions I had about McQueen at the start of the year are still kind of there, whereas Smith has answered a lot of my questions. I'm a lot more comfortable in my projection of Smith, whereas there's still just that uncertainty with McQueen that I have a hard time squaring, I guess you could say. I mean, the good parts of his game are still there. I've been watching him since he's come back. He's still very clearly not 100%. He's not at the best of his ability, not even close from my perspective. But he's still a guy who shows just so much raw potential. I mean, you've got a guy his size who skates pretty well, who handles the puck really well. He's dangerous as a shooter. He's very dangerous as a playmaker. He's a guy who's, I think, able to stay a center at higher levels. Sometimes he shows some physical elements to his game, not always, but I think that's there. I think you could work with him on that to learn how to use his body a little bit more effectively. But there's still just so many questions. I mean, his team's not helping him. He's playing on a Brandon team that doesn't have the most cohesion. They haven't really gelled a whole ton all season. Not a lot of firepower to help him out. But there are games even now when he's back where it's just there are mistakes and there's times where he's just not really making a huge amount of difference. I mean, I still think overall he's the biggest wild card of this draft. I wouldn't be surprised necessarily if he went as high as 3, just because there are teams out there that might think that they can still work with him, develop, all the different aspects of his game that are enticing and, get a lot of improvement in different areas. I mean, the best case scenario for him is still, a number one center with size who can, wear a lot of different hats. That's really, really hard to find at the NHL level. That's hugely valuable. So I could certainly see teams being willing to take that risk. But at the same time, I have a hard time bumping him up our list right now because of that same risk. There's just too much that I want to know more about with him. Whereas I think others around him, Danoe is another good example. I thought he's had a very tremendous season. He's been very consistent. I have a very comfortable opinion of him now and what he's going to be at the NHL level. But I just can't really reach that with McQueen yet.
And I think part of the issue too here is what's happened with Caden Lindstrom this year, right?
Yeah.
Similar injury concerns last year. and now he's missed the entire year. And I think that sort of weighs in the back of our mind here when we're evaluating McQueen and evaluating the risk versus the reward here. And you kind of get concerned that it's going to be a similar sort of situation there. Rightfully so, or not, right? Whether that's unfair, possibly. But with something so recent happening with Lindstrom, I think it plays into your evaluation whether you like it or not.
You have to. There is a risk there. I mean, there are varying opinions as to how much risk there is, but the risk is undeniable. If you just say there's no risk at all of a reoccurrence of his back injury, it's not a really realistic approach.
Moving on, past Roger McQueen, Brady Martin coming in at 12. Jake O'Brien, just behind him at 13, was one of the big risers, moving up 10 spots from the previous ranking. Just past, or one past him is Colin Potter. A little bit later at 18, Ben Kindel and Braeden Cootes at 18, 19. So we're comfortable saying that Hagens, Denwanier, Frondel, and McQueen, then you draw a line in terms of tiers of centers.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think that's very fair to say, to be honest, Kyle.
Okay, and I think Martin and O'Brien are kind of an interesting comparison, just on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the standings, and the help they've had around them. And O'Brien has moved up a lot based off of his play, and a lot of that has been, spectacular players like Nick Lardis and Merrick Vanacker around him. So, Brock, was it you advocating for Jake to be pushed up the board, or were there a lot of scouts on our team that were, high on this guy? Because I've seen his name mentioned a lot as, again, somebody that someone just could snatch up a little bit higher than expected. I mentioned Keishon Aitchison before we did this interview. Just because everything's there other than really the physicality, and that seems like something you can work on quite easily with an experienced development playing
Yeah, it's
staff.
you'd like to think that I was the one really pushing for O'Brien to move up our draft list when my expectations for him are still a little bit tempered. I still have some concerns. His 5-on-5 production, his skating, the frame, his ability to get to the middle at the pro level. There are some things that I am concerned about. Um, I probably have him a little bit lower, but some members of our team are very high on him and his upside. And ultimately, I think that's what it comes down to is this is one of the smartest players in this draft class. And when he's fully mature in terms of his physical development, you like to hope that the skating is going to tick up, that the physicality and ability to handle it, fight through traffic and play through contact, all that stuff's going to improve. The even strength production will improve because he's such a smart player and he is skilled as well. And he's also a guy that is really detail oriented. He's good at both ends. He can play in any situation. And I think that brings value as well. When you look at the players ranked in this range, they all have inherent risk, right? Brady Martin as well. Other players available in this range all have risk associated with them. And O'Brien has performed incredibly well this year. And he's one of the few guys in this range that we can probably confidently say has definitive top six upside. And that's why he needs to be ranked accordingly. That's why he is a serious candidate to be taken, possibly even in the top 10, if a team really falls in love with that upside, because a really intelligent playmaking center who can play in all situations, they're hard to find. And you have to hope that your development team can improve some of the areas that he's lacking in.
I find it really interesting that we've, you know, raised O'Brien and Martin on our board kind of side by side because with the two WHL guys that were also just mentioned, it's a very similar sort of situation with like Ben Kindel and Braeden Cootes. Two guys who are playing mostly center right now. I don't know if Kindle will stay center moving forward, but it's possible. Um, and they're side by side because I love the upside of both of them, but they're such different players in similar ways to O'Brien and Martin, where Kindle is, I would say, the overall smarter of the two. For my money, I think he's one of the smartest players in this entire draft class. His decision making is phenomenal. His vision is phenomenal. It's very, very rare to see him make the wrong decision. He's deceptively good defensively because he just understands the flow of the play around him. He knows how to time his decision making to, make steals or, clear the zone. There's a lot there. The offense is really, really high end, superb playmaker, excellent with the puck, has a deceptively good one timer. The wrist shot could be a little bit better, but I mean, the guy scored 99 points this regular season for a reason. Like, he's got a lot of offensive pop to him. And then you look at Braeden Cootes, who doesn't have the same amount of production and probably just doesn't have the same offensive tools overall. But there's so much else to like about him. Like Brady Martin, high character center, excellent work ethic, excellent leadership, just a true warrior. The type of guy that will always give you 100% whenever he goes over the boards. Has a sneaky amount of physical skill at times. Like, he really will go hard to the net. He'll win battles for pucks just because he's hungrier than the other guy out there. But there's also skill to his game. I just am working on a feature profile on him right now, going through tons of tape. And I had a lot of examples to draw from, both for his playmaking ability and his shot. There were a lot of instances where, he was really making some dangerous stuff happen offensively. And I think that was hidden a little bit because of the team around him. It's hard to score when you're the main focal point offensively, and you're not getting a lot of easy points just from secondary assists and easy puck touches. So, yeah, I think it's interesting that we have Martin and O'Brien side by side and both as risers, but it's a similar story out west with Kindel and Cootes.
The next name I wanted to ask you guys, I'll probably come back to you, Derek, is Cameron Schmidt. He's down 8 spots from our last ranking. Is that just a matter of kind of tier juggling and stuff like that? Or, has there been something you're looking for in his game that just hasn't been there?
Yeah, I've been looking for a little bit more variety in how he plays and what he brings. Like, he's a very good player in certain ways. He's great off the rush. He's a great quick strike attacker. He's a great finisher on the power play. But the rest of his game, what you might call his B game, is a little lacking, and it has been for a lot of the season. Um, there's just so much of an adjustment for a guy that size and the way he plays that's going to be necessary at the NHL level. I mean, he's a guy who does his best work when he's, got his foot jammed on the gas pedal. He's just flying down the ice. He's exerting all of his energy. But that's a really hard way to play sustainably. I mean, at the NHL level, with the grind of the game and just being a professional athlete, there are going to be times where you're not going to have that amount of energy. You're going to be banged up. You're going to be bruised. You're going to be slowed down. And you need to be able to find ways to adapt your game and be effective otherwise. I think we've seen a little bit of that with Logan Stankoven this season, where, he was shot out of a cannon last year in his NHL call-up, and was the same way at the start of the season. But then he went through a lull, and his production dipped and his ice time dropped, and he really had to find that B game where he's able to be effective in other ways. I mean, he still hustles his butt off. He's still great in that way. He still has that quick strike ability, but there is there's an element of adaptation that's necessary. And with Schmidt, where while I still like him overall, I just haven't quite seen as much of that as I would like. I mean, there's still a potential for him to kind of figure these things out. I mean, if I was working with him, I'd tell him to watch a lot of Logan Stankoven tape, a lot of, Cole Caulfield tape. There's still a very good chance that Schmidt can become a bona fide top 6 offensive weapon at the NHL level, but just there's a little bit of risk as to whether he's actually going to get there. And if he doesn't, really cement himself as a top 6 player, at this point, it's hard to see him being someone who is effective in a different kind of role. I think there are a very narrow number of pathways to him earning a roster spot on an NHL team and being successful. And I think that is the main reason why he's been bumped down our list a little bit. But, it was not like we're listing him as a do not draft or anything. Like, there are concerns, but there's also a lot of upside that he's really earned just with his play this season. He had 4 points the other night, I think, in a big game for the Giants, trying to come back in the third period, 4 or 5. So he's still a guy with a lot of talent, and he's competitive as heck. There's a lot to like. It's just there's also a certain amount of risk, and trying to find the right way to balance that can sometimes be a challenge.
Yeah, and another guy that you could probably use as a comparison would be Nick Robertson and what he's gone through with the Leafs and trying to figure out a way to have a successful B game and stay healthy and be able to translate his goal scoring ability from junior to the NHL consistently. It's just so much more difficult for those smaller guys to find that niche, if you will. So yeah, I think that there's the risk is sort of why he's pushed down our draft board just a little bit.
We've talked before about how Aitchison could be picked higher than where we have him ranked, or even the consensus have him ranked. If someone really loves that profile and thinks they need it, and there's no one else like him in the draft. On the flip side, do you think that somebody might take Schmidt a little bit earlier, going, everybody's afraid to take this kid? Is there a possibility that someone may really kind of back themselves in their ability to see the project through with what Cameron Schmidt could become?
I
Yeah,
doubt
I
it.
think it's.
I mean, Derek maybe has an opposite view. I think he was about to speak before I interrupted him because
I
I'm
don't
rude.
think it's no, that's fine. I don't think I wouldn't say it's necessarily likely, but it's a possibility. Maybe a team that has, two first round picks and they're not afraid to take a bit of a swing on another risky kind of player. I mean, Schmidt like has legitimate goal scoring upside. Maybe if you're a team like the Montreal Canadiens and you've worked with Cole Caulfield and helped him overcome the limitations of his size, maybe you think you could do the same sort of thing with Schmidt. I would say it's a possibility, but overall I think the risk is a little too high. There have been talks about Schmidt, maybe not even being picked in the first round at all. I would say that's probably more likely, but I mean, if there is a team that is really, really desperate for adding some goal scoring into their prospect pool, I mean, I could see him going maybe as high as the teens, but I would say outside of the first round is probably more likely. And then some team will probably, be thrilled to get him in the second round, like Dallas was with Stankoven.
Yeah, and that's basically what I was going to say is the NHL draft history suggests otherwise, right? These are the types of players that do fall. Logan Stankoven is a great example of that. I think back to Jordan Kyrou in his draft year, right? Like these are the kinds of guys that
Mhm.
NHL teams have serious translatability or yes, translation issues with. And I think it's more likely we see Schmidt fall out of the first altogether. Colin Potter is another example. Obviously, we have him rated highly. We really like him, but in all likelihood, he's drafted considerably lower than where we have him ranked, and we're fine with that because we believe in his ability in the long term. This is our list. This isn't, an NHL list per se, right? But these types of players are the ones that push come to shove, scouting directors are not going to be quite as high on because there's risk involved based on size and history.
So, looking at kind of the 20 to 40 range, there's been a significant amount of movement from our last rankings. Just to name a couple of guys, Bill Zonin has moved up 23 spots to 32nd overall from Maroon Miranda in the queue. Luke Romano is down 20 spots to 44th. Um, Ivan Ryabkin from Muskegon, the Russian centerman, is down to 39. That's down 13 spots. So could you just kind of, yeah, outline this tier? Obviously, I think this is where you kind of start to see those bigger movements because it's hard to make those kind of jumps at the top of the rankings.
Yeah, and
Yeah, there's
sorry, Derek, continue.
Yeah, I was just gonna say there's a lot of movement right now in this range. There's a lot of differing opinions. There's not a lot of concrete consensus in this sort of range. There is that 15 to 20 guys who, might be a first rounder on some boards and might be much lower on other boards. I mean, you mentioned Radkin, and I'd be fascinated to know where he is on every single draft list in the NHL and compare them all because I think you're going to get a lot of differing opinions. I think we kind of took a middle ground with where we put him on our board, where he did drop, but there was also some talk and some potential that we would drop him a lot further just because he's still kind of an enigma for this draft class. I mean, you watch him, since he's gotten to Muskegon, and you still see the good. You still see a guy who's got a lot of offensive awareness. You've got a guy who's really dangerous with the puck at times. Get him in the offensive zone, get the puck on his stick in a dangerous spot. And he can make a lot of things happen. But the other parts of his game that have been concerning are still concerning. I mean, he looks like a guy, frankly, who's not in very good shape and is not very well conditioned. He doesn't look very athletic, which is a concern because it shows up on the ice. He's not very fast. He's losing a lot of physical battles too. He goes in at times, like he's not afraid to get his hands dirty, but he's a guy who's just getting outworked and out hustled, and that's a huge concern because he's playing against guys at the USHL level, and when you get to the NHL, everyone is a very high conditioned athlete. It's the best of the best, and you don't want to pick a player in the first round that's going to get outworked by every fourth line in the NHL. There is still the question of, what is going on with Ryabkin? Is that just who he is? Does he just does not like to train off ice? Are there limitations to his skating that he's not working on that maybe can't be fixed? Or is this just maybe an immaturity thing? Maybe he's still adjusting to North American hockey. These issues were there in Russia, but maybe there's just something about, what's holding him back that he doesn't know yet. And I think there are some teams that are probably very interested in working with him because they see the underlying talent. They realize how good he could be if he's just able to work on these other parts of his game. And maybe they don't see that as much of a risk. Maybe they think they can work with him, work on his diet and his training and his nutrition and all that important off ice stuff and really help unlock the true potential of his game. But yeah, he's dropped a lot for us on our list recently. I think there's still a chance he could drop more depending on if we can see any progress in his game between now and the end of the season.
Yeah, and I'll highlight a guy, not one that you mentioned, but another one of our big risers, and that's Cole McKinney. We've been pretty big fans of Jack Murtagh pretty much all year with our lists, but I would say he and McKinney have sort of run the show at the NDTP this year, and McKinney has played incredibly well in the second half of the year for that program. He is a detail-oriented, high IQ two-way pivot. And as we've talked about a few times in this episode, those can be hard to find. Doesn't mean that McKinney maybe has the highest upside of some of the centers available this year. No, but there's a really good chance that he's going to play in the NHL. Maybe he's just a Scott Lawton type, but those have value. And those types of guys can have long NHL careers. And I think that with his strong play to close out the year, you almost have to reevaluate McKinney's upside as well. Maybe he is a solid number two who can play in any situation. And I think that just based off the improvements that he's made over the course of this year, you have to be excited about this player. And I'm really excited to see how he performs at the U18s because I think he's really trending upwards. And he's someone that I really advocated for to move up on our list into the first round. And I know that our scouts that attended the recent Nations tournament also advocated for him because they really liked his play at that tournament. So I think he's a guy that's really on the upswing.
I'm curious if, in general, you think we might see some Americans rise up boards just a little bit based off that tournament, the U18s, and having literally all the eyes on them, playing their own age group, etc.
It's the nature of the beast. The European players and the US players always tend to make their mark at this year-end tournament. It happens year after year, and it's not going to be any different this year. There'll be some guys that really turn some heads at this tournament and make everyone sort of circle back to look at their tape from the rest of the year. And sometimes that works out in their favor. Other times, it's just a single tournament's performance and you don't end up wanting to put too much stock into that. And there are every year guys who have these amazing U18s that actually don't end up getting drafted. And other years, those types of guys who have these big U18s and have strong pushes end up becoming really solid NHL players. So it's kind of like a trade-off. I think you just have to sort of circle back on guys that have really strong tournaments and see where they started from and how they're finishing. But it happens every year.
Yeah, and it's a two-edged sword or a double-edged sword, like Brock had said. But there's also some validity to it too. I mean, I don't think you can form your entire opinion on a prospect based off their play at that tournament. But it's, another chapter in the book. You talked about the European guys, Brock, and if you have a European player who's been playing against men all season long, maybe he's down in the lineup, maybe he's not getting a lot of ice time. You put him against guys his own age, you're going to see a different side of him potentially, and that might give you a more well-rounded opinion of the player, for better or for worse. Similar story with the U.S. guys, right? They're a lot of the times they're playing against college teams and players that are older, bigger, faster, stronger, and sometimes that can be limiting. Sometimes they're playing against like really bad USASL teams, and the NTTP wins like 8-0, and you don't really learn a lot from those viewings either. So I think it's a good final chapter where you can learn a little bit more about a player. And I think it's okay to maybe adjust your final analysis and projection of one of those players depending on how they perform at this tournament.
Yeah, I was talking about this specific crop of US U18 players too, just because it has been labeled as a bit of a disappointing year. To kind of finish out the year with a fair look at them, I think will be interesting as opposed to the CHL versus CHL versus USA games, which, I don't think I gathered too much from them on the American guys. I wanted to tell you guys a little note before I move on to the rapid fire section. So if you look at the Russian players that came before Ryabkin in Muskegon. Matt Vigridin, Daniel Gushchin, Igor Afanasyev, Andrei Svechnikov. Do you know the commonality between all of them?
They've all played in the NHL.
Well, they've all played in the CHL too. After they played in Muskegon. So
Right.
kind of just an interesting note, obviously. Nothing out there, and Ryabkin doesn't have any college commitments or anything. But I remember when he signed, looking that up and being like, it's so weird. Like most of them just stayed 1 year and then jumped again to the NHL after playing a year in the CHL. But I'd like to try out a bit of a new segment, a bit of a rapid fire thing, just to get some quick thoughts on a bunch of topics, some draft superlatives, some positional stuff. So I'm not sure how we could do this order. I could start with Derek and Brock every time. We could do a snake order. Derek, Brock, Brock, Derek.
I think
Sure.
sounds fine.
Okay, so I'll remind you, but we'll start with Derek, Brock, Brock, Derek, Derek, Brock. Okay, so we'll start with you, Derek, the best skater in this year's draft.
We've talked about him already, but I would say Schaefer. But I also want to give a shout out to Jackson Smith because I don't think a lot of people really know how good he is yet. He doesn't get a lot of eyes on him in Tri City, but it's looking like he's going to be at the U18s. And I think a lot of people are going to be kind of blown away by the way he can skate.
Brock?
Yeah, hard to argue with that. I think the only other way that you could is if you wanted to view it as fastest skater, then you probably have to talk about a guy like Colin Potter.
Okay, coming back to you, Brock, the best shot in this year's draft.
That's a tough one because I think there's quite a few guys who can really fire the puck, but I don't know if we have somebody that I would consider to be like an elite level scorer. I think you probably have to talk about a guy like Anton Frundell. He's probably near the top. Porter Martone, Cameron Schmidt, maybe even like Jack Murtagh. There are a bunch of guys who can really fire the puck, but none that I would consider to be like absolutely elite level goal scorers. Like I wouldn't expect anybody in this draft class. I think you probably throw Michael Misa into that ring as well. Um, there's a I don't know if anybody in this class is like a consistent 50 goal scorer at the NHL level. I just don't know if I see it.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Brock there. I mean, the first name that popped in my mind was Frondell, but definitely Schmidt as well. He's pretty dangerous, and Misa, you could say, would round that out. But yeah, not maybe not a true sniper in this draft class.
Derek, would you say Misa is the best playmaker in this year's draft?
Ah, I would still probably go Hagens over Misa. I mean, we talked earlier about Misa versus Hagens, and I like Misa's overall game more, but just from a pure playmaking standpoint, I would probably have to give it to Hagens.
Brock?
Yeah, I would throw Jake O'Brien into the ring there as well. If we're
Mhm.
talking pure playmaker, um, I would say it's either him or Hagens.
Okay, and Brock, I know this is kind of a broad term, gets used for a lot of different meanings, but best smarts, best hockey sense.
Yeah, again, we probably have to talk about Jake O'Brien. Again, this is a guy that is as high as he is without some of those physical tools because he's such an intelligent player. Obviously, Matthew Schaefer has to be mentioned here. He's number one for a reason. He's definitely one of the smarter players in this class. Outside of that, Derek, maybe you can come to a great name here because Schaefer was sort of the first one I thought of outside of Jake O'Brien.
Yeah, Schaefer for me. Danoe, really, really smart player, like got great attention in all three zones, really strong understanding of what to do shift to shift. And then Ben Kindel, who I mentioned earlier, just love his hockey sense, just the way he thinks and the way he makes decisions on the ice. It's pretty special.
Just a couple more here, then I'll get you. Just a couple more here, then I'll let you go watch some CHL playoffs. Um, the highest taken goalie after Joshua Ravensbergen, Brock.
That's a tough one. There's so many different names that, excuse me, that could be mentioned here. Uh, I'm going to go with Medvedev out of London. I think he ends up being drafted higher than even Kovic, just based on the size and the physical profile. It could be one of the Russian goalies as well. I mean, it's so up in the air. I mean, Burke Hood is a guy that I know Derek really likes out of Vancouver. He could end up being the starter for Canada at the Olympic Gretzky. And if he has a really good tournament there, he has the physical attributes that NHL teams are going to really, really like. So there's a lot of guys that could be mentioned here.
Yeah, Brooke Hood has had a tremendous back half of the season. Like he has been the savior of that Vancouver Giants team. And when I watch him play, he already plays a very NHL style of goaltender, very economical in his movements, very square to the play. Very very buttoned down technique. There's not a lot of leaking in his form. And then Brock mentioned some of the Russian goalies. I really like Semyon Frolov out of Russia. He's similar to Hood in a lot of ways. Really, technical, consistent, focused. Not a lot of overexertion or scrambling in net, but just really, really solid and reliable.
And last but not least, Derek, the highest taken or your favorite re-entry player.
Oh, highest taken. I don't even know.
Um,
You want me to take this one first then? Because I have a clear name in mind because he's out of my region.
Sure.
And that's Christian Epperson. I would be
Oh
shocked
yeah.
if it's not him. He's had such a strong year. You watch Saginaw play, and it's not just about playing with Michael Misa. This is somebody who's creating his own chances. He's creating for Misa. He's really, really shown well after exiting the program and sort of falling out of favor there. He's a really impressive player. I'd be shocked if he's not taken in by the end of the second round.
One of my favorites, I would have to say, and it took me a second to remember, is Julius Sumpf, who plays for Moncton in the QMJHL, had a great showing for Germany at the World Juniors. Was a real star for them there, and I liked him before that tournament. I liked him after, and I could see him being a guy who goes in the top 100 if a team really likes what he brings. Because there's a very safe NHL floor to his game. He's got some size, he's got some mobility, he's got some puck skill. He can play down the middle. There's just a lot of different things about his game that are very good. Nothing that really jumps out as elite, but just a very solid all-around hockey player. And if Moncton goes far in the playoffs, which it's looking like they will, there's going to be a lot of extra eyes on him. And if he's a big part of their success, I think it'll really um, convince teams that there's a lot of safety to picking him.
well, guys, it's been so much fun talking to you guys, and the videos are only going to ramp up to more and more as we approach the draft and the most fun time of the year. So, Derek, Brock, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks for listening, everyone.